Okay, good morning, everyone. We'll call the meeting to order. I understand I have Mr. White, Mr. Johnston, and Mr. Laux on the line. Is that correct?
Yes, yeah. And we'll call it up.
Okay. All right, to begin the meeting, I'd like to take a moment of silence to remember those that have fallen since the last time we met. All right, thank you. All right, the first order of business would be a motion to approve the minutes of September 21 and October 18th meetings. Okay, it's been moved and seconded. All right, all those in favor of the minutes as presented, please signify by saying aye.
Aye. Aye.
Okay, that motion carries. All right, we'll get right into the work here and invite Lisa Wan from the Actuary's office here.
By way of background, as Lisa comes up, this is a follow-up to a presentation that the board had earlier this year. The board recommended and the legislature passed a bill last session to create a window for retirees to purchase an annuity. And Lisa's here to follow up with you regarding the administrative factors required for those annuities. And with that, I'll turn it over to Lisa.
Great, thank you, Steve. Good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Lisa Wan with the State Actuary's Office. And as Steve mentioned, I'm here really as a refresher, a reminder of the issue, because it has been 2 months since I presented to you. And this is up for board action today. And just as a reminder, it's not a requirement to adopt new factors, but it is a recommendation from our office. So as I mentioned, I'll start with a little bit of a refresher just to remind you of the issue that's before you, and then go into our recommendation and some next steps. So administrative factors are in place to adjust members' pensions when they elect optional forms of payment. So when they're electing something that's optional, administrative factors will adjust their benefits so that it's of the same value. SSB 6264 passed in the 2016 session, and that allows current retired Left 2 members a one-time window opportunity to purchase an additional annuity. So if you recall, I think it was maybe 3 sessions ago that a bill passed that now allows Left 2 active members at the time of retirement to purchase an additional annuity. This bill was allowing a window for current retirees to also access that type of additional benefit. When our office prepared the actuarial fiscal note, we assumed there was no cost to that bill because we assumed actuarial equivalent administrative factors would be adopted. Now, for this type of benefit, this optional annuity for retirees, there are 2 different administrative factors that apply to them. The first one applies to all, and that is taking what lump sum amount they have and applying a factor to determine what is their monthly pension they will get with that lump sum. So that will apply to all, and those factors DRS has right now, and they are based on the age at the time of purchase. So if you have a 65-year-old retiree, DRS will use an age 65 administrative factor to determine what their monthly pension is. The other factor is the one that we're here talking about today, and that is for anyone who's currently retired and already has a joint and survivor pension, so their base pension from Left 2 is being paid as a joint and survivor. It's in that form. They have to convert this new additional benefit also to a joint and survivor. DRS pays one type of pension benefit. So if they're purchasing an additional annuity and they're already on a joint and survivor, their additional annuity will also be a joint and survivor. And so this is why we're here to bring forward new joint and survivor factors that apply to older members of the system. Because currently, yes, Kelly?
So Lisa, that they don't have an option at that point to revert or anything. They're on the joint and survivor, so they've got to, if they purchase an annuity, it's going to be under joint and survivor. No choice.
That's correct. DRS pays a total benefit in one form. So if they retired and left it as a single life annuity, their additional annuity would be on that same form.
Okay.
If they're joint and survivor, it would be a joint and survivor. So again, the joint and survivor factor is adjusting benefits so that a pension payable on 2 lives is equal to the pension payable on 1 life. So I provided this same table last presentation in September, and the table is really showing you how the new factors are different from the current factors. So DRS has joint and survivor factors right now that they use to administer Left 2's benefits, but those were developed for the average member at retirement age, because otherwise you would have like these very large tables for every joint and survivor option. Because the joint and survivor factors are based on the age difference of the member and their annuitant, so we have prepared for DRS joint and survivor factors that are based on the average retirement age for Left 2. So moving to joint and survivor factors for a member in retirement who typically is older than at retirement, this is how the new factors would vary. So if we look across the average line there, roughly close to 3 to 5% difference in the factors, which relates to a 3 to 5% difference in the final benefit payment that's going to be made. So this next example also I shared in September, just showing how the impact of the new factors would translate to someone who, say, has elected to purchase a $2,000 additional monthly benefit. So there would be a difference by using the new factors that our office is recommending. There would be a difference in that person's benefit of $66 a month. We've added the next slide to help see the bigger picture, and this is based on some feedback I had after the September presentation. So if you recall earlier, I said there's 2 different factors that get applied to a member who's purchasing an additional annuity in retirement, and this table will help you see what's going on. So the example is we have member 1's going to retire in January of 2017 and has $100,000 of qualified savings that they want to use to purchase an extra benefit from Left 2. Member 2 is already retired, and under SSB 6264, this member has a 5-month window starting January 1st, 2017, where they can also purchase an additional annuity. And for this example, this member also has $100,000. So what will happen is, in each of these cases, we first start with that $100,000 they have, and then we convert it into a monthly benefit, and that's that purchase factor there. And if you recall in the earlier slide, I shared that the purchase factor, the annuity purchase factor, is based on the age at time of purchase. So you can see why those numbers are different. And really what that's saying is member 1 is going to be able to purchase almost $6,200 in annual benefits. Member 2 is able to purchase over $7,600. And that's because they're older. They're going to have less benefits. So their $100,000 is worth more monthly. Everybody with me on that one? The next column over the joint and survivor factor, this is the one where we are recommending that the board adopt new factors. If the board doesn't, the 0.855 would also apply to member 2. And what we're saying is that because this member is older, it actually costs them a little bit more to purchase a joint and survivor at that older age. And so you can see that even though they have the same amount of money to purchase, member one will still have a smaller benefit because they're going to receive it for longer, right? They're age 55 versus member two can purchase more because they're older and they will inevitably receive less benefits. So I know that was a lot, but I was hopeful that I'm able to show that with the purchase factors, they are already, DRS already has the factors that are age-based at the time of purchase. It's the joint and survivor factors that we're recommending the board update those. So again, just to recap, our office is recommending new joint and survivor factors to apply for this 5-month window to satisfy our analysis on SSB 6264. So the next steps, we also provided the full communication with all of the new factors in a document for the board. And the board has the authority to adopt the factors. DRS adopts them for the other plans, which they have adopted factors that will apply to State Patrol. And the factors would be applied during this temporary window, January through June 1st. And with that, I'm happy to take any more questions.
Any questions in the telephone world there? No, I take it there are no questions. Well, Lisa, thank you. That's a tribute to your explanation.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Director, do we entertain a motion to adopt the new factors?
That would be the next step. This adoption of the factors will require a motion.
Okay. Okay, it's been moved and seconded to adopt the new factors for the one-time purchase of annuity. Are there any questions or comments? Seeing and hearing none, all those in favor of the motion, please signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Aye.
Those opposed, no. Okay, that motion carries unanimously. All right, thank you, and we will move to item number 3, which Director Nelson will facilitate.
All right. By way of background, as you'll recall, the merger presentations that I've been doing this interim have been in the form of Q&A, questions and answers, because that's the way the merger topic has been framed, is an enormous number of questions. Many of those questions are legal, and many of those questions are actuarial. It was hoped that at the time of your the November meeting, we would have answers to all the state law legal questions from the AG's office, answers to all of the federal questions from Ice Miller, the special attorney general hired on the federal tax issues, and questions on all of the actuarial issues answered from OSA. However, the date of the November 9th, or the November meeting, was moved up. And so that did not allow sufficient time for all of that analysis to be completed before your November meeting. So I will present to you today the results of the actuarial analysis that's been done so far, and the results of the federal legal analysis that's been done by Ice Miller so far, the remainder of the state law legal analysis, and the remainder of the actuarial analysis will be presented in December as part of your final report. Now, for today, in your report, I updated the report to include all the questions that are out there. As the advice comes back from Ice Miller and from the Attorney General's office on state law issues and from the actuary's office, those responses will just be included in the report as is, as appendixes. So there's not going to be any kind of incorporating it. It'll all be there. And then that report, reminder is a reminder for you, that report will then be presented to the select committee and incorporated into an overall report along with their teachers' analysis that'll go to the legislature in January. So this is not a complete and final report, but I do still anticipate that you will have a complete and final report in time for your December meeting. With that, let me dive into this. I wasn't sure what types of which board members would be here and which areas of interest would be there. So again, this is meant to be conversational. Some of the stuff, if I'm skipping over something that I've talked about in the past, but you've had a new question come up, and I know many of you have contacted me in between meetings with different questions about different things, it's completely fair to stop me and bring up a question about something that I may not be covering in detail at this meeting. But I do plan on spending quite a bit of time talking about, well, I don't want to make that sound. I plan on covering the information on the legal and actuarial stuff in as much detail as you'd like. So I wasn't planning on going over merger and termination again at this meeting, but or the purpose of a merger, but as a reminder, and this will come in later on, merger itself is financially neutral, but the merger legislation that we've seen in the past hasn't been, because part of the goal has been to create state savings by using merger. That's done by reducing the contributions to the plan. By way of refresher, for Left Plan 2, that's $130 million a biennium. So if you're looking for kind of the box or the range of savings, the most that the state could save from a Left 2 merger would be $130 million a biennium by reducing the state contribution. And again, that's not technically that's not part of the merger. That would be a separate part of the bill, but 130 million is what they pay, and the rate can only be reduced. The lowest it can go is 0. I've talked to you in the past about who owns the Left 1 surplus and the exclusive benefit rule. Ice Miller talks about that as well in their analysis, so I'll defer on that. Bit of history about how the Left 1 surplus came about. Largely from investment returns. There were some other actuarial assumptions that were overly, as it turned out, overly conservative, particularly like inflation assumption. But the contributions that were made by the state and the timing of those contributions in getting in there for the run-up in the investment markets at the end of the 1990s, that's where you saw, let me go back, you saw Left 2 here in 1995 at less than 70% funded, and by 2000 it was over 130% funded. So by far the greatest impact on creating the Left 1 surplus was the run-up in the investment markets that occurred in the second half of the latter part of the 1990s. Talked about the share of the state contributions the last time we spoke, how the contributions to the plan were historically, what the proportionate share was, because there had been some discussion about from both the employers and from the members about, well, if the state is going to share in this surplus, how would that, what's our proportionate share of the contributions that created that surplus. In particular, the employers had asked about using surplus assets for funding retiree medical benefits. The IRS has some requirements about how well funded the plan has to be in order to use surplus assets for medical benefits. And you can only use assets in excess of 125%. At the time of the last valuation, Left Plan 1 was right around maybe 126%. Given the investment return over the past year, I don't think that Left 1 would meet that 125% test any longer. So that's where things sit on that. For the amount of the surplus, I do want to talk about this a little bit different. I have, by kind of set the context for the actuarial analysis that's coming up. I've told you in the past that the surplus is a moving target, if you will. It's how much the surplus is. Literally, it changes month to month. But valuing how much it's changed month to month is a challenge, and you can get monthly market asset data, market value of asset data from the State Investment Board. But in order to calculate the surplus, you'd also need actuarial liability stuff. We'll talk about that later. And you need to have an idea of how some of these assumptions are or are not, like the investment assumption, playing out. But what I want you to understand, the way that 1.97 billion, it's easy to think of that as you've got $1 billion, more than you need. But from a technical sense, mathematically, the way it looks right now is, no, you've got, say, $4 billion in assets, $5 billion in assets. You've got $7+ billion that you know you're going to have to pay out, but you've got time to pay out. So you're expecting that $4 or $5 billion to earn money over time. So when you say you have $1 billion surplus, technically what you're saying is you are projected to have more assets than you need when all the liabilities are satisfied at some point in time in the future, and the present day value of that future surplus is 1.97 billion. Now, even though saying that you are projected, that is a likelihood. So that would be a percentage. And that's the actuaries working on giving you that part of the analysis isn't complete, but you want to be able to say, there is say a 50% likelihood that amount in the future will be such that the present day value is 1.97 billion. There's it might be less than that, it might be more than that, but all the assumptions hitting equal, I picked 50%. The numbers, the percentages, or the likelihood of that is the analysis that the actuary's office is still working on. So it's very easy to think of that as $1 billion and not consider all the different factors that go into calculating that $1 billion. Senator?
There. Thank you. You said that this changes month to month.
Yes.
Is it going up? Is it up and down? Can
Yeah.
you explain how much of a change?
And that's one of the things that we're that one of the questions that we sent to the actuary's office is, can you calculate that accurately on a monthly basis. Can you tell us month to month how much the surplus has changed? And the answer is no. I'll talk about that later. But for instance, you're assuming that you're going to, part of that surplus is you're assuming you're going to earn 7.7%. And so if you don't, then the surplus is less. There's other assumptions, though, inflation, how many members are going to, the mortality assumptions. So there's a lot of moving pieces to that, but one of the most obvious ones is that earnings assumption. So, for instance, I'll talk about this in more detail when I get to the actuarial slide coming up. Merger itself doesn't affect benefits. Merger legal. Now, state law issues we will be talking about in more detail at the December meeting when we get the final analysis, the result from the AG's office on the questions that were sent over. They'll be looking at how some of these different issues affect state law here in Washington, state law considerations. Here is kind of an outline of the way the advice that they are working on. Again, we don't have the answers yet, but this is a draft, if you will, but an outline of the types of analysis that they're working on for the board. In a nutshell, you can consider it this way. A merger, regardless of whether it's a left-to merger or a teachers merger, there's going to be issues for all mergers. And then there may be, the analysis may be slightly different depending on whether it's left-to or TERS 1. And then there may be some other issues that are different, that apply specifically to a left-to merger, for instance, governance, or apply specifically to a TERS 1 merger, for instance, different types of employers. So there'll be subtle differences between the two types of mergers, but there's going to be some issues that are going to come into play all merger, regardless of any merger. For the federal law issues, and this is where we have got some preliminary answer, or preliminary response from the Ice Miller, the special attorney general firm that was hired to do this analysis. They considered a whole host of questions for both the select committee and for the left-to board. And they kind of took this list of questions and they answered them for both of you. Again, in some cases, the analysis is slightly different based on the different characteristics of left-to versus TERS 1, but the questions that were asked were all the same. In order, public pension plans get a lot of favorable tax treatment. Your contributions go in pre-taxed. All the money that the state investment board earns on your contributions while they have them for 25 or 30 years, that all those earnings happen tax-free, and then you pay taxes only as you begin to receive your pension eventually. That favorable tax treatment comes with being a qualified plan. A merged plan is considered a new plan, so it would have to be the new plan would have to be qualified by the IRS. Now, the types of, let me back up here. The types of questions that Ice Miller answered, there was some, in general, I think it's fair to say that they are of the opinion that they believe that a merger, that the new plan would be considered a qualified plan. Now, the details of the merger, they were looking at the TERS merger last year, so the answer could be different if a bill, a left-to bill, they didn't even have one to look at. If a TERS bill is substantially different from last year, maybe that would affect the answer. The key question, the key issue for them, they felt is going to be looking at the exclusive benefit rule. So it's not so much the merger itself, but are there other provisions that that create issues regarding the exclusive benefit rule? Are left one assets being diverted for purposes other than paying benefits to left one beneficiaries? Under the exclusive benefit rule, that can happen. And so the framework of the teachers merger bill, that wasn't going to happen. What was going to happen is that the state would sort of take accounting credit for the existence of this surplus and then not take money out of the teachers fund, but reduce state contributions in to the teachers fund that were scheduled to pay off the unfunded liability. And so, as I mentioned earlier, the same type of mechanism would likely be at play in a Left 2 bill. They wouldn't take money out of the fund. They would just reduce their future contributions into the fund. And that approach, historically at least, hasn't been considered to violate the exclusive benefit rule. It's been done by the legislature. Contribution rate reductions have been done by the legislature a number of times. In this case, though, one of the things Eismiller did say strongly is that they believe that the merger should be conditional on receiving the final IRS approval. That kind of came back to that answer in response to a couple of different questions. But that piece, then you avoid any of the concerns that you might have as far as unwinding the plan if the IRS did come back and say, no, that doesn't work. So that was one piece of the Eismiller advice, that there was a provision in the teachers bill last session that said, DRS has to seek advice, approval from the IRS before the merger, but that didn't actually affect the date of the merger. And so that working out of that deferral would have to be a bit more clear in a future bill. Some of the other questions, though, that came up that I thought were, that we haven't talked about, that I haven't talked about with you in the past, that would apply to merger that Eismiller did talk about. Duty-related disability benefits receive favorable federal tax treatment. If there was a merger, would that affect the tax treatment? And I think in particular there was concern about what if we're merged into teachers? And what Eismiller was clear is, no, the definition of a public safety officer under federal law isn't changed, and it isn't changed by which plan you're in. There are a number of states around the country where all the public safety officers are mixed in with other plans, including in some states teachers. And no, so the federal tax treatment of your pension would not be affected by a merger. One thing that would be affected by a merger, though, was how the surplus assets for Left 1 are reported on financial statements. It was kind of a lesser understood impact of the changes that the Government Accounting Standards Board made a couple of years ago, that it just appeared in this most recent round of CAFR annual financial reports. For most plans, they had to show their share of an unfunded liability as a debt for the municipality. So, for instance, PERS 1 has an unfunded liability, an amount that is owed above what the projected assets can. Every city and county on their annual financial reports had to identify sort of their share of the unfunded liability and show that as an obligation. For Left 1, though, that actually worked to their advantage. Since it's in a surplus status, they actually got to identify a small surplus. Instead of a debt, they got to show that, in a sense, on the books at least, as an asset. A merger would affect that. And so if it was a merger with Left 2, that would, in a sense, be a wash. They also get a small credit for the positive funding status of Left 2. If you merge the two plans together, the amount of the credit would be different, but it would be on a larger amount, so dollar-wise it would be a wash. But with teachers, that wouldn't necessarily be the case. So whatever that credit showed on their books, that might go away entirely. One of the other, and that was a subtle, that was an interesting question, and it was something that I had not spoken with you guys at all about. So I wanted to particularly mention that one. Those were sort of the three issues. There's strong advice to defer the finalizing of the merger until the IRS is approved. No change in the status of duty disability benefit taxation and this GASB reporting change. Those were three of the things that I specifically wanted to bring to your attention that were different. But again, their overall conclusion, I think, was that they thought IRS approval, qualification would be likely. They specifically said disqualification of a plan is sort of the most extreme option that the IRS could take. It's more likely that if they identified some concern, that they would suggest remedial corrections to the plan to Washington that could be fixed in a subsequent bill. That is where things stand with Ice Miller. The same questions and the same responses were provided to the select committee with respect to their portion of the study. For your portion of the study, once the Ice Miller memorandum is final, it'll be included in total, unedited, as an appendix to your report. And so all the questions and all of their answers will be included in the final report that you have in December, and included then in the final report as it goes to the legislature in January. Now, are there any other questions about the Ice Miller stuff before I move on, the federal tax stuff before I move on? Because I know this is the first time that you've heard it, and
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair. Steve, before I go off on a flyer again here, is this an appropriate place to discuss some of the content or conclusions they've drawn, or should I save that for later?
no, it's fine.
I'm mixing things up here. There's several pieces of sausage, all in the case here on this. When you talk about fundamentally, when you talk about it's inappropriate to divert funds from either one of the trust funds for other purposes, Bakken protections, and yet you talk about at the same time maybe with a current inflow from employers, employees, and the state, whatever ratio between the two systems is chosen. When you defer funding or remove funding, decrease funding on that, and yet apply that money elsewhere, where it would be illegal to actually take it out of the trust fund to do it de jure, but de facto you're accomplishing the same mission.
Yes.
This is an accounting trick.
Now, and since you're a lawyer, I'll give you kind of the legal answer. Taking money out of the trust fund would be a violation of trust law. Decreasing the flow of money in to the fund might be illegal, But it wouldn't be illegal because of trust law. What would come into play there is a series of court cases, Weaver, starting with Weaver v. Evans, where state law has identified to what extent is your benefit promise based on the underlying funding. And the court said you're entitled, as part of the Bachenhaus benefits, you're entitled to an actuarially sound method of funding. So that it'll be a separate question then whether the diversion of incoming contributions does or does not pass the Weaver test. So that's the distinction between the two. But it's not a trust law issue at that point in time. And Eismiller was very clear about 25 times in the memo that they are not talking about any state law issues. So to the extent that that mechanism does or does not violate state law, they provided no analysis on it. That would be hopefully part of what we're getting from the AG's office on the state law issues.
Any other questions? Okay, Steve.
All right. Now, the actuarial risks. One of the, by way of kind of setting the context, a lot of the questions that were sent to the AG's office were trying to identify what risks are there to Left 1 today, before a merger, if you will. The idea being, if you can identify kind of where things sit before a merger and then where things sit after a merger, you can better understand sort of the impact of merger. And so, for instance, Left Plan 1 is 126% funded. But I mentioned earlier that $1 billion surplus, that depends on a lot of assumptions happening accurately over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So what are the likelihood that those assumptions wouldn't happen? You know, for instance, is there a chance that Left Plan 1 right now today, with no merger, could come out of full funded status and require additional contributions? Is there a chance? What is that chance? So that's where, what are the risks? Where is Left 1? Where do Left 1 risks exist today? And then you could evaluate whether or not a merger increases, decreases, has no effect on any of those risks. In particular, are some of the risks that might exist in Left 1 today being transferred potentially to Left 2 stakeholders as part of a Left 1, Left 2 merger. Now, some of the questions, let me see if I've got them here. Yeah. Some of these questions, OSA was already able to answer. Even though the date of the meeting got moved up, they were sufficiently far enough along that they were able to provide what they had already answered. That material is included in your materials, and it'll go out as part of, but it's, even though it's clearly identified as preliminary, once they complete their analysis and finalize their report, that again will be included as a appendix to your final report in December, and I'll talk about it in December, and it will go unedited then into your final report and into the final report of the legislature. So, back in 2015, or 2010, I think that's right, the OSA did a Left 1, Left 2 merger study. And at that time, they were talking about, in particular, one of the risks that they were identifying is what is the risk that Left 1 is going to go into what's called pay-go status, which means you're paying as you go. The benefit payments that you're making that month are coming right out of your budget. The fund has been exhausted. Well, that certainly is an important risk, but there's also the risk of, well, what happens if it just goes below 100? Then at least you would think that contributions would be required, and to the extent that those contributions might be required of employers or the state or both, that certainly is a risk that the board would like to be aware of, and that's a new piece of the analysis that OSA is doing this year that's different from the past report. One of the concerns that came up in the roundtable discussions that the select committee had was the demographics of Left Plan 1 are a bit unusual. They're different from some of the other, all the other plans in the sense that they are virtually all retirees. There's fewer than 100 active members, maybe fewer than 50 active members right now, about 7,500 retirees. And so does that demographic mix, a plan that's all retirees, no contributions coming into the plan currently from members, employers, or the state, does that demographic mix come with certain risks? And in particular, the investment risk. If you don't have contributions coming into the plan, if you don't have a salary base to charge future contributions on, then if you have adverse investment experience, the only way to make it up is with better investment experience coming afterwards. And so there is the investment return risk in particular is one that exists for Left 1. Now, one of the concerns that came up in the roundtables very strongly was, you guys, the assumption is you're going to earn 7.7%. How reasonable is that? That's a bit higher than the actuary initially recommended, 7.5. Does that make a difference? And it's also, to some extent, higher than what we might be expecting in the near term. All the reports from, say, the State Investment Board that have been that it will be challenging to meet the 7.5% earnings assumption in the very short term because of the low interest rate environment that the economy's in. What does that mean? Does that create a risk there for Left 1 that means that the surplus is more overstated than it should be? It's one thing to say, yeah, we think it's still reasonable that we're going to earn 7.7% over time, but what would it look like if that was 5% for 10 years, and then you make it up with higher returns further down the road? Okay, so OSA was able to do some of that analysis, and I'll share the results with you. And then what are the probabilities? So OSA has a very powerful modeling system right now where they can analyze what the impact would be on rates or on the funded status of a plan by modeling thousands of economic simulations. And then they can come back and they can give you percentages. So they'd be able to say, hey, all things being equal, there is a X percent chance that Left 1 could come out of full funded status. That analysis is not ready for today. That'll be part of the analysis you'll get in December, that what's called stochastic analysis. But some of the other questions that came up, how do the teacher's bill from last session included a $5,000 payment to all the retirees? Does that affect the likelihood that Left 1 could come out of full funded status? And then what are the consequences if it does? All right, so diving into it now. A couple of these questions. Have the life expectancy recommendations that OSA made been fully incorporated into Left Plan 1? They have been into Left Plan 2? Yes, they have been into Left Plan 1 as well. So to the extent that there was a concern that the surplus amount might be overstated because the life expectancy figures hadn't been incorporated, no, they have been incorporated. Down here, the question, when OSA did the fiscal note for the proposed TERS 1 Left 1 merger, the actuarial data was updated from the most recent valuation to the date of the fiscal note. And so this kind of gets to your question, Senator. How easy is it to update the amount of that the surplus, to calculate the amount of the surplus once you move away from the valuation date? The way it works is OSA will use, for their modeling future investment returns, they will use actual investment experience up to the date of today. So for instance, if they were doing a fiscal note today, they would incorporate actual investment return performance from July 1 of 2015 to today, and then assume 7.7% from then on. But they do not update the liabilities at all. So the amount of the surplus that's going to show up in the fiscal notes is going to be based on the most recent actuarial valuation, which was the 2016 valuation, which was based on assets as of June 30th, 2015. So to some extent, that actuarial information is out of date. And unfortunately, because of the timing of session, it's sort of right before June 30th when the new valuation information would be available. OSA, though, is working on improvements to their system where in the future they hope to be able to sort of project or estimate the next valuation, which would be helpful for doing this kind of stuff. But at least for now, you're not going to be able to get monthly calculations of what is the value of the surplus this month. I know that is a question that I got asked a lot, still get asked a lot. And so now, hopefully, by putting this into the report, it'll be clear as to why you can't really answer that question. The calculation of the actuarial liabilities can't be done on a month-to-month basis. That's done once a year as part of the valuation process. I did ask, is there some way to ballpark it? The actuarial valuation is very precise. Is there a way to come up with a less precise way? So, could you go back and see, well, how much have the liabilities changed from year to year, and kind of come up with a trend, and then maybe project what it would look like for the next year, and then divide that by 12 and come up, that's not the kind of mathematical work that the actuary's office does. So to the extent that you get some kind of ballpark, I don't know. They are legislative employees. If there was a real demand for something like that, maybe they could come up with some way to ballpark it. But you're not going to be able to get that kind of analysis from me for certain. So that is one of the challenges talking about merger, is really how much is there? Because the actuarial information will be a little bit out of date. Now, some of the other answers. What's the risk? Out of the questions here. OSA specifically looked at what happens if they earn 5% for the next 10 years. No, that would not move them out of full funded status. What about the $5,000 payment? No, that would affect liabilities by about 1%. Wouldn't have any material effect on moving the plan out of fully funded status. What about this short-term risk? The idea that the plan is more subject to short-term risk. Yes, but it's more susceptible in terms of a shock. So the example of 5% over 10 years, that's more like slowly letting the air out of the balloon. You're missing your assumptions, but over time and not by a lot. That type of risk is less of a concern for Left One. The bigger concern, the type of investment risk that could knock Left One out of fully funded, would be something like a negative six. The example that they gave in their response was a negative 6.2 return next year and another negative 6.2 return the year after that. So it would take a shock, not a slow, gradual underperforming of assumptions, but something dramatic. Now, what's the likelihood of a shock like that happening in the next 2 years, 5 years? That's the kind of risk analysis that you'll get in December to kind of put some actual parameters around the amount of that risk. But at least for understanding today, that's the type of risk that Left One is vulnerable to, a sudden, sharp downturn. That could, if it was sufficient enough, that could eliminate the surplus and create the risk that Left One, regardless of merger, would come out of fully funded status. Now, the effect of the non-merger, that's just Left One today. So where the merger stuff is, that's still being considered by OSA. So yes, a 5% return over 10 years isn't going to dip Left One over below 100%. Does that change if now the plan's not getting 130 million or 300 million in contributions that it was originally projected to get? That's the next step of the analysis. The $5,000 payment, that didn't have any material effect. Ultimately, that totaled, I want to say, about 40 million. So that gives you an idea of sort of the scale of that particular payment compared to some of the other funding reductions that have been considered, whether that's 130 million a biennium for Left 2 or 300 million a biennium for Teachers 1. That analysis will come in December.
Steve, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to go real pedestrian again, like a simplistic common denominator. You have addressed every potential asymptomatic expression of a situation that would potentially bring Left One or a combined fund after merger into underfunded status, and gone through and explained why each one of these is improbable. Much more simplistically, though, we're talking about addressing the potential for underfunding status and the likelihood of that, when in fact what we're doing is we're talking about removing contributions that may well cause an underfunded status, and then ultimately the people that would be responsible for backfilling the underfunded status would be the state or the employers. Now, if the money taken was used to address the medical cost to local employers from Left One, I could see their willingness to assume the risk of doing something like this down the road. With the state, this almost feels like politics, like we're playing in caucus here, to where we take the money out now and kick the can down the road so there's a liability for somebody else potentially later, while we're creating it and benefiting from that now. I mean, the premise underneath here, one more thought, just to confuse things even further. As a board, our fiduciary responsibility is specifically to left two. And I can see some acceptance or assumption risk on our part being prudent if there's a potential return on investment or benefit to the members according to our mission statement. By say, for example, doubling the size or increasing by 50% the size of the trust fund, and our ability to capture the increase in scale for return on investment so as to provide better for our members. But again, on the front end of this, as you reduce the contribution rate to the state's advantage, but potentially to the members' disadvantage, and reduce the potential benefit from having an increased basis from which to have to acquire return on investment, the whole thing, the foundation under everything you're talking about here, it doesn't exist. I'm having a problem with it.
Okay, that's a great question, because I want to clarify that first part, where you said that I've systematically gone through and shown where that is improbable. I want to make clear that this analysis that you're getting today is only based on essentially the pre-merger. So the additional piece, how does the underfunding then create or not create a probability that the plan could come out of full funding? We don't have that today, and you'll get that in December. It may show that also you'll get more of a possibility in quantified. So, for instance, you might get, well, if there's a left one, left two merger, and if the state takes a full $130 million reduction in their contributions, there is a 16% chance that the assets would be insufficient to meet the liabilities and require a contribution rate increase in the future. And then you as a board, you as individual fiduciaries could evaluate, is that a prudent risk? Is that a reasonable risk, et cetera? But we don't have that type of analysis, and we don't have those types of numbers for today. Today is mainly giving you the framework so that you know what types of risks OSA is analyzing and considering, what type of data we expect to get in December. At least I think it's fair to say that in general, pre-merger, Left Plan 1 is in a healthy spot. No surprise that many of the risks of failing to meet actuarial assumptions, for instance, the difference between 7.7 earnings assumption and a 7.5 earnings assumption, doesn't create any substantial risk that the plan will not come out of full funded status. Left 1 is in a very healthy spot right now, so it can actuarially, it can weather a number of different risks. But the one thing that it can't do today is the sudden investment shock scenario. What's the likelihood of that? We'll get more information on that in December. Now, the follow-up piece of that is, well, in addition to the sudden investment shock, what about the underfunding? What is the consequence of the reduction in contributions to the merged plan on affecting these pre-left likelihood or pre-merger likelihood, post-merger likelihood? And you'll be able to get more of that hopefully then in December and answer some of the questions or concerns that you were talking about. The second piece, the Ice Miller advice, there was something that was really interesting that hadn't been really talked about. In addition to the idea of merger and the idea of termination, they talked about consolidation, and your question kind of turned on this. What happens if you kind of merge the plans? You merge them for some purposes, but not for others. So for instance, in a pure merger, all the assets, all the liabilities are available. But what if you say, for instance, well, we don't want the left one people to now become, or employers, to be liable for or to be on the hook financially for TERS liabilities. Is that now sort of picking and choosing which parts of merger you're going to apply, and how is that treated by the IRS? And Ice Miller said, well, that's what's called a consolidation. The plans are already consolidated in a number of different purposes. They're commingled for investment, they're commingled for benefit administration, and just by picking and choosing itself, that doesn't necessarily disqualify or create a merger. It does change the analysis a little bit that the IRS will go through. So to the extent that picking and choosing which parts of merger you're going to apply gets, too extreme, that's where Ice Miller said there could be IRS concern. That's one of the reasons why you would, again, defer finalizing the merger until you get that final IRS approval. But similar to merger, though, the main area of risk that they identified had to do with the exclusive benefit rule. So to the extent that a merger appeared to be violating, or a consolidation appeared to be violating the exclusive benefit rule. In this case, for instance, what if in a left two merger, they said, no, one of the ways we will manage that risk to the left two members is we'll say that in the event that future contributions are required, they'll only be paid by the state and the employer. Well, then that's a deviation from sort of a pure merger, and that might affect the IRS analysis slightly. But again, all of that would come out in the details of the bill. The actuarial piece of that, the quantifying that risk, is the goal of all these questions, and hopefully I say hopefully, if past experience is any indication of the future, as soon as we get all these questions answered, there'll be more questions. Policymakers will have more questions during session. But at that point in time, that'll be for them, and for the actuary's office, your responsibility as far as the study goes will have ended December 7th at your final board meeting. But as all the questions that we kind of know today, risks that came up in all of the roundtable discussions, those have been forwarded to the actuary's office, and they're working on answering them, and they expect to have the answers for your December meeting. One of the other interesting things is, we talked about the state being on the hook for paying the contributions if it reemerges. That's actually kind of an open question because it depends on when the liabilities reemerge. There is a requirement in statute that if an unfunded liability exists, it has to be paid off by 2024. Excuse me. The statute is completely silent as far as what happens after 2024. So the timing of when that unfunded liability emerges becomes sort of an open question. The funding policy that exists in statute is only good for about 8 more years. And even then, it's a statute and it could be changed. So when an unfunded liability emerged in PERS 1 and TERS 1, that liability was shared with the state kind of charged employers like I've used this example in the past, the PERS 1 unfunded liability. We don't have any PERS 1 employees at the Left Plan 2 Retirement Board. But we pay a little bit every month towards the PERS 1 unfunded liability. The state calculates a percentage of pay for all PERS employees, including Plan 2 and Plan 3, and the employer pays that. And so one of the concerns was that if they do the same in teachers. And so one of the concerns was if a liability emerges in Left 1, would they apply the same funding policy, and Left employers would then begin paying a supplemental rate like they do in PERS 1 and TERS 1. That's an open question. But after June 24th, it's all open questions. There's nothing in statute to indicate what would happen in that situation. All right. Now, that was a lot, and it was a lot of actuarial stuff. If you've got policy-type questions along the lines of yours, Representative Holy, I can certainly answer those. If you've got more mathematical questions, I've got backup here from the actuary's office. But again, there'll be additional analysis and follow-up presentation at your next meeting in December. The hope is that, again, all of those questions in your report that we've been talking about since June, and many of the questions that have been added to it as we've gone along, one way or another, as best as they can be, they'll be answered, and that'll be included in your final report to the legislature. So, questions?
Steve, I was going to ask, I know we have at least one Left One member in the audience here, so if you have any questions, feel free to participate. Don't want to exclude you from that ability to, so if you have any questions of Steve, feel free to have a seat right over here and ask those questions if you'd like, if you have any. Yeah, you're welcome. Yeah, and just for the record, your name and, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Roy Orlando, and I'm a director with the Retired Firefighters of Washington. President Warbrook was unable to be here today. I'd like to thank you for the hard work you've done and thank the committee, or the board. Director Nelson, I believe I've only got one question. Were these slides posted online, or will they be?
Yes.
Okay. Were they online?
Yeah, they are.
When did they go on?
They went on. All the materials went online. When did you say? Friday. Yeah.
Okay.
All the merger materials are public, and all of the documents, they're right on the home page. There is a merger study link that will include all the most updated documents that the board
At
gets.
OSA?
At Left 2 Board.
Okay.
The Left 2 Board website.
Left.wa.gov.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, the only thing that is not on there, for instance, the memo from the actuary's office, that was received, and that is in there. The memo from Ice Miller right now is still draft, and so that's not on there and hasn't been shared with the board. But as soon as the memo is final, which should be before the December meeting, it will be in there with the report and everything else.
Okay, thank you. And one other question for clarification. You discussed governance a little bit. Have any issues been addressed going forward of what governance would look like for a Left 1, Left 2 merger? And I guess specifically, what kind of representation would Left 1 have?
There's a whole range of possibilities. At one extreme, nothing would change. Left 1 would still have their current governance structure. So the disability boards would still do disabilities. The Pension Funding Council would still set rates. The Select Committee on Pension Policy would still study policy issues and make recommendations to the legislature. That could go to a different extreme where the Left 2 board or the new left board would set rates, but that probably would, there's no expectation that any contribution rates are ever going to be charged to Left 1 again. So that probably wouldn't be necessary, that you'd have, that you'd need to transfer rate setting authority. And in the past, as far as recommending future benefit changes to the legislature, when that came up in 2010, there was the general consensus among the Left 1 stakeholder groups at that time was they'd rather just stick with the select committee. And so if that's still the consensus, then that's probably the way the bill would end up, is no changes to Left 1 governance at all.
Thank you.
One of the governance concerns, not for Left 1, but for Left 2 that came up after 2010 is, again, your primary responsibility right now as a board has to do with setting the actuarial assumptions for Left Plan 2 and setting the contribution rates for Left Plan 2. And so to the extent that a consolidated board was created with Left 1 stakeholders, and then there's a challenge, having Left 1 stakeholders, if you will, adopt Left 2 rates. How would that, mechanically, how would that work? So in a sense, in the time of 2010, it was the Left 1 stakeholders wanted to kind of keep their governance the way it was anyway, and that mechanically that might work out clean for the Left 2 stakeholders as well. So you could avoid a lot of issues like representation by just leaving things the way they currently are.
You're welcome. Okay, any questions here from board members? Anything further? On the phone, anybody? Okay. Thank you, Steve. And our next item is Steve's administrative update.
All right, let me come back up to my chair where I've got my notes. All right, for the outreach, or for the administrative update, it'll be fairly brief. Outreach from board members, there was a presentation. I made a presentation to WACOPS, their fall meeting in October in Chelan, talked about the activities of the board this interim and where some of those issues sat. Tammy attended the Fire Commissioners, Fire Chiefs meeting, Eye to Eye Expo in Yakima. By way of good news, the Public Pension Coordinating Council presented the Left Plan 2 Retirement Board with their annual recognition award for plan funding for 2016. Again, it's 2 years in a row that the board has received this, and it is, in my opinion, it's a testament to all the hard work that you've done in recognition of the great results that your funding policy decisions have had on the plan. So a copy of that and a notice of that award is on the website. That is everything that I have. Right now, there's no scheduled outreach activities between now and your December meeting. If you have any questions, though, I'd be happy to answer them about anything else administratively related.
Any questions for Steve from any board members on the phone? Okay. So item number 6, our last item on the agenda, is items for future meetings.
The December meeting will be fairly like today, the agenda will be fairly compact. So again, for planning purposes, it's probably going to be about the same length as today's meeting. There will be the final presentation on merger and public testimony related to that. You will adopt your 2017 meeting calendar, and so there may be some last-minute maneuvering for different dates and so forth, but we'll be prepared to work through that with you. And then the final results of the Office of the State Actuary will be presenting their risk and analysis, update of their risk analysis study, risk assessment study. That presentation is scheduled for December, but the merger presentation will focus primarily on the state law issues that we receive and the remaining actuarial issues that the analysis that we'll receive on those. That's the plan for December. There are no other topics, no other issues scheduled for a final proposal which would to recommend to the legislature. So other than sending your study to the legislature, at this point in time, there's not expected to be any recommended changes. That's the plan for December.
All right, do we have anything more to come before the board? All right, just want to let everybody know before we adjourn, lunch is available before you leave. It is in the break room there, so without any further delay, we will be adjourned until the December 7th meeting. Thank you, everyone, and have a good Thanksgiving.